Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by a grant from New Mexico Tech on the frontier of science and engineering education for bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees. New Mexico Tech is the college you've been looking for. 1-800-428-TECH. And by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Dr. Ralph Metzner. Thank you for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
I must tell you, you really are a cultural icon. I'm going to tell our audience a little bit about your background. You had a bachelor's from Oxford University in philosophy and psychology, a PhD in clinical psychology from Harvard, and there you were among a group of three really gifted people, Timothy Leary, Dr. Richard Alpert, and yourself, who did the Harvard psilocybin project. Am I right so far? Mm-hmm. And
it was a larger group.
It was a much larger group.
Yeah.
But the three of you, it's kind of crystallized to the three of you in terms of the mass culture. In a way, you are a cultural icon, and you have been exploring consciousness and mind and the expansion of consciousness for years and years. You co-wrote a very famous book, The Psychedelic Experience.
Right.
You edited the Psychedelic Review. Your books go from the maps of consciousness to the well of remembrance to green psychology, and now we have a whole batch of newer books. This was 2008, The Expansion of Consciousness. We'll talk about the big one. Two small ones that have just come out, Alchemical Divination, and you have a foundation that, and then Mind, Space, and Time Stream. And the big one that brings you to Santa Fe is called The Birth of a Psychedelic Culture. And this is a fascinating piece of history. It's reminiscences of you and Baba Ram Das, which is the other name of Dr. Alpert. Dr. Leary, unfortunately, is deceased. And so you tell about what it was like to be kind of Marco Polos of the mind, exploring new things. Tell us about that time and tell us about the stories in this book.
Yes, it covers a 5-year period from about 1961 to 66, when I was a graduate student. Leary and Alpert were professors at Harvard, and we did the studies with psilocybin, which is the active synthetic ingredient of the Mexican mushroom, which has a whole tradition in Americas in shamanic uses, and which we didn't know anything about. And they produce basically these substances, and this was Leary's concept of consciousness expanding. Nowadays people say psychedelic, but I actually prefer the concept of consciousness expanding, because those are words that everybody can, because then you actually think, wow, what does it mean to expand consciousness? Who knew that it could be expanded, right? It was like that's kind of a technical term. It's like a genre of art.
You mean reproduce the classic mystical religious experience. Didn't you call that the Good Friday study?
Yes, that was the idea. It was Walter Pankey, who was actually an MD already and was getting a PhD in psychology of religion. And it was a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, and the classical kind of drug study that one does, and with following Leary's paradigm that the set and the setting are the key determinants of an experience. So people were seminary students, divinity students at a local theological seminary, and the setting was a chapel, the Good Marsh Chapel, and on a Good Friday ceremony run by Howard Thurman, who was a minister, who was actually a good friend of Martin Luther King. And during Good Friday, but in a separate room in the church, broadcast down, and we had groups of students, participants from the seminary, and assistants like myself and other graduate students from the Harvard project, and some were getting psilocybin, some were getting a placebo, and nobody knew who was getting what. So, and then they had tests and interviews and questionnaires of 8 or 9 different criteria of a mystical experience from the literature of mysticism, and so the results were very, very clear that the people who had the psilocybin
had
all the classic elements of a religious experience.
And this was what I love about this is it was really the scientific double blind.
Yes,
it was
right.
you were really doing the science.
It's probably the only study that's ever been done. It was called experimental mysticism. I mean, normally people think of mysticism as the opposite of scientific experiment.
Yes, yes.
But that's not the point. The point is not this. You can be scientific about anything. You can, including you be scientific about your subjective experience, and that's what the behaviorist paradigm, which was the prevalent Harvard paradigm at Harvard, doesn't understand. You see, and because they think it's only scientific if you're measuring behavior. And that's not true. But the essence of the scientific method is you make repeated observations, you control as many variables as you can, and you replicate, and you have different people, and you repeat and you replicate, and you compare the results from different people, and you gradually accumulate observations that way. And that's called a radical empiricism, which is the formulation of William James, who said, it's radical, it's empirical. All your knowledge has to be based on observations, but then no knowledge is excluded from observations. You don't a priori say, well, drug experiences are excluded. See, that's what the scientists had said at the time. Well, you can't call that a valid experience because it was all induced by the drug, which deranged your brain. And so in the same way, science won't accept parapsychology because they say, well, it can't happen. It's impossible. So, and that's not scientific. And so I think our work was in the tradition of William James, radical empiricism, where objective, repeatable observations collected in a naturalistic environment, not clinical and not laboratory. Those are the two kind of most prevalent paradigms in psychology for, and they were collaborative studies, naturalistic and collaborative studies, where we being the graduate students and the professors, took the drug with the prisoners in the prison. And we took it with the people who were, having the seminary students, and we shared observations. So it's much more like an exploration. Well, okay, so you make those observations, and we each make our observations, and we'll compare the notes like that.
But it was absolutely groundbreaking work. Mind had not looked at mind before like that.
That's right, because there was no way to do that.
Yeah.
These people could have had life-changing experiences before, and they've had mystical experiences before, but they happened few and far between, and occasionally, and then they were written up in the literature. And there was no kind of reliable way to do it, frequently. I mean, not that it's guaranteed. When you take psilocybin, it's guaranteed. It's not guaranteed at all. It all depends on the set and setting. You can't just drop LSD and expect to have a mystical experience. It won't happen. But if the circumstances are right, the set and setting and the intention, then it may happen. But other people used it in a therapeutic environment, which is a completely different set. They're not looking for mystical experiences. So if they have them, it's sort of incidental or it's surprising. It's a surprising effect. Now, a similar thing happened with people when people started using LSD in the treatment of alcohol, and people had these bottoming out experiences in alcohol and reproducing these experiences of alcohol. And LSD was used in the treatment of alcohol. There were 6 alcohol treatment centers in North America in the mid-'60s. And but then people said, well, this goes way beyond, getting over the addiction of alcohol. Like, I'm talking to God, I'm having mystical experiences. So what is that? And that whole attitude and that whole process has been incorporated in the AA movement. The 12-step process of AA is like step number 2 is, I give up control of I've lost control of my life.
Yeah, I admit that alcohol is,
And I surrender to a higher power, however that may be conceived. So it's non-denominational, not specific to religion, but it's however I conceive. And Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, took LSD. That's not widely known. And he actually wanted to include it in the treatment program again, but fortunately his cohorts talked him out of it, because if he had done it, it would have been all over. He wouldn't have had the program, because LSD became illegal, inaccessible, and sensationalized, and it works much better without it. It's not necessary to it. It's not necessary, actually, to the process, but it helps the process. That's the best way to think of these substances, that they amplify the processes they're doing. So if you're doing therapy, it can amplify process. If you're doing creativity, it can amplify creativity. If you're studying mystical experience, it can amplify that.
I want our audience to know that some of this work is still ongoing.
Right.
Talk about the work
It's
that's
ongoing
being...
again.
Again.
There's been a hiatus for
the-
about 40 years because of the sensationalized, which kind of spread throughout the whole culture. So the drugs became illegal. All the use of LSD and other psychedelics became illegal, therefore underground, and therefore secret, and nobody really was keeping track, and nobody really knew, although many thousands of people take it and continue to take it as best as they could. It was an underground culture. It's an underground culture, had its own literature and its own. But now, because some of the sensationalism was worn out, so official circles are now FDA and DEA, again, are giving permission for carefully controlled studies application. One of them, for example, is in the using of psilocybin, which is the one that we worked with at Harvard, in the treatment of anxiety around death, which is, I think, one of the phenomenal possible applications. This is not as a treatment for cancer, but as an alleviation of the anxiety and the negativity around dying. This is where my friend Charlie Grove, who's a psychiatrist at Harvard, UCLA, did a study with terminal cancer patients who've been told they have 3 to 4 months to live. That's it. Giving psilocybin. And there was a beautiful short film made of a woman who described her experience, no prior experience with psilocybin or any other psychedelic drug. She's describing how she had all these fears, about what her life is going to be like, and the pain and the discomfort and death, and how her husband of 28 years was negatively affected, and how grieving he was, and all these terrible feelings and grief and guilt and shame and fear, and she said they congealed into a sort of a mass in the center of my chest, and then they just dissolved. And I realized that all the fears were about something that hadn't happened. And I had my life, and I had my husband, and my life was beautiful, and I could enjoy it, and I could focus on it, and I could smell the flowers, and I could devote myself to the garden, and my children, and my family. And she took up yoga, and did other practices to improve the quality of the life that she had left. And I think that's what I would call a classical consciousness expanding experience, because when you expand consciousness, you realize you come into the here and now. You realize, I don't have to be as I was in the past, and I don't have to be living my life in terms of these fears that are coming in the future. I can be right here, right now, and then I have all kinds of other choices that are open to me.
I want to talk a little about the death of your friend Timothy Leary, because you gave a wonderful eulogy in 1996 about his death, but you talked about what a visionary philosopher he was and how much he taught. Actually, his greatest teaching was in his dying. Will you tell our audience what his last words were?
Well, I'm not actually sure.
What I have read, you may not have been there, so let me say, he repeated the phrase many times in different inflections, why not?
Why not?
Why not? And then apparently his very last word was the word beautiful. But why not?
Right.
What a way to do that transition.
He did this weird thing. He went public. He did like to do everything in public. So he went on there. He says, I'm looking forward to it like a long trip, like going on a journey. I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I know it's happening. I know I'm going to leave. I don't know where I'm going. I have no preconception, but I'm looking forward to it. Like a psychedelic experience, I have a positive attitude and positive expectations, and I hope to make the most of it. For a while there, he got very involved in cryonics and freezing his brain for posterity and then having it reanimated. I thought that was kind of absurd. There's an element of his thinking was kind of ridiculous, but it's interesting, and it was encouraging to me that about last 6 months or so, he just gave up that whole idea, and he said, this is not what it's about. What he did do instead is he called all his friends, including me and others, and said, look, I'm basically dying. I probably have about a year or so. Why don't you come down? Let's talk. And up to that point, I hadn't been, and he did that with many other friends, and we had a kind of a reunion. Actually, we have a picture of the Harvard project, in the year before he died, the few months of the year before we died, and the different friends came together, and we had the opportunity to talk about some of the things we hadn't talked about, and lots of different, because we only really worked together for a very, very intense period of about 5 to 6 to 7 years at Harvard and at Millbrook after.
May I say that those were absolutely transformative years for our culture.
For our culture, yeah.
I want to quote a few of your words from the eulogy. But you had said the 1960s were an explosion of consciousness, both individually and collectively. And I want to read this because I want our audience to understand how far-reaching the effects were. There was a movement of social transformation that had at its heart an expansion of consciousness that catalyzed movements of social transformation. The anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, women's liberation movement, the sexual revolution, the ecology movement, the revolution in the arts. This was absolutely transformative for our culture.
Yeah, new perspectives, new points of view, new possibilities.
Yes.
Every time you expand consciousness, you have new